People renting a house or an apartment can run into disputes with the landlord over things like repairs not being made, late fees, even evictions.
So what rights do a tenant have in Texas? We sent KLTV7's Willie Downs to find out.
When landlords refuse to make repairs to protect health, safety, or security, in certain circumstances, tenants have the right to end the lease, withhold rent to pay for repairs, or file suit to force repairs. That's according to the Office of the Texas Attorney General. Tenants must be current on their rent and follow other criteria as well. Research Director with Texas Housers, Ben Martin, says despite those options, low incomes often keep renters in bad situations.
And eventually the squeeze is too much, and you find people making the lowest incomes losing stable housing through eviction, through being unable to find a place to rent that they can afford.
He says 1 in 5 renters in the state of Texas pays more than 50% of their income towards rent.
That's money that they can't pay towards groceries, gas, utilities, and other essentials.
Martin says some cities, like San Antonio, are creating a tenant's bill of rights to offer protection to tenants. They want this to expand to other cities as well. The Tenant Bill of Rights offers a number of protections for renters, to include ensuring rentals meet minimum health and safety standards, repairs are made in good faith, among others.
There is a number of imbalances in the system in Texas right now that really give an advantage to landlords and disadvantage tenants.
Their mission is to ensure that all Texans have access to safe, decent, affordable, and stable housing. Willie Downs, KLTV7 News.
And the Tenant Protection Act was filed at the Texas legislature this year to further address many of the issues low-income tenants face. To learn more about the renter rights provided by the Attorney General's office, scan the QR code on the screen, or you can go to kltv.com and again click on the big red box.